Hey everybody, today we got a £250, not dollar build. And this is actually going to be a £250 build, not one of those videos where they're like, oh, we got a £250 build, but it's not really a build, it's just Google Images. No, we've actually got the build. We've got all of the parts, physically. It's an AMD APU build, costs less than £250. And it's not, well, it's a gaming APU build. It's not really a gaming PC, but it probably can play a lot of games. It's not a gaming PC. But for the CPU, you've got the AMD A8 6600K. This is a 3.9 GHz CPU. Well, it's APU, and that has the 8570D, I think. For the motherboard, we got the Gigabyte F2 A55M HD2 version 1.2. The reason why this board is just because it's the cheapest board out there for FM2. So that's about it. It does a job. It doesn't have USB 3. It doesn't have SATA 6 gigabits per second, but it does a job. For the RAM, we got 8 gigabytes of generic crucial DDR memory, DDR3, and it's running at 1333 megahertz. Now, you should really be using 1600 or higher, but it wasn't in the budget for this build. And you know, some people say you should be using 2400 megahertz RAM. Because it's an APU, it's going to be using the onboard memory instead of doesn't have any GDDR memory. But you know, if you've got the money for 2400 megahertz RAM, then why are you buying an APU? If your budget's so high you can afford 2400 megahertz RAM for a gaming build, don't buy 2100 megahertz RAM. Take that money, spend it on the graphics card. Get a proper graphics card, like a GTX 450 is a low-end graphics card that'll outperform this CPU, this APU. And then get the cheapest possible RAM. I don't care if it's 1000 megahertz, just as cheap as you can get it, and that'll still be better than this APU. So yeah, we got 1333. That's just how it is. For the power supply, we have the Evergo 430 watt power supply. I don't know the model number, but what I know is that this is an 80 plus power supply. It's a single rail power supply. It's probably the best power supply you can get for this amount of money. And this is a really quiet power supply. I was amazed how quiet it is. I turned on and I couldn't hear it. It's quieter than my power supply. I have OCZ-ZS in my main machine. And usually what I would recommend to people is if you only have 250 to spend on a gaming machine, you should just buy it pre-built. Not from Dell or from Packard Bell, that's not what I mean, but I mean from a business that sells pre-built computers that they build themselves with APUs. Because I looked on the internet and found plenty of shops that sell machines like this pre-built, and they were selling it cheaper than the total cost of the parts that I bought. And that's what I would recommend. But when I looked really, really closely at the descriptions of these computers, same specifications as mine, cheaper, but the power supply, they don't say what power supply they use. And usually what you get when you're buying cheap pre-built computers is terrible quality power supplies. They'll be loud, they won't last very long, and you really don't want a bad quality power supply in your system. I mean, it might work, but for how long? And what's going to happen when they stop working? Usually what you would have in cheap PCs like that is you would have extremely cheap power supplies like this. This is a 500 watt ATX power supply, and it cost me about £5 new, and it works fine. But with power supplies like these, first of all, they're really noisy. I was ridiculously noisy. So if you've got a cheap fan controller, cheap components, and with power supplies like this, they say they're 500 watts, but I guarantee you, if you put 500 watts, you pull 500 watts from this power supply, it will explode. It'll explode at 200 watts probably. They're just not quality power supplies. And you can just tell because they're extremely light. They feel cheap, and these are really not something you want to be using on your computer. So that is why these pre-boot machines are so cheap. So until now, I would have actually recommended that you just buy the parts pre-built, because you know these retailers will get the parts cheaper than you. But now, I would definitely recommend you build your own system, just so you know you're getting quality parts. Okay, for the hard drive, we've got the... Well, I didn't actually buy a hard drive with this build, but I have like 20 of these hard drives lying around, just new hard drives. I've got nothing to use them with. They're 500GB Dell Enterprise hard drives, and they're essentially just rebranded Western Digital drives, but they've just been certified by Dell to use in Dell servers. So I threw one of those in there, and I will add up the equivalent cost of how much it would cost you to buy a 500GB drive into the build. I'm not going to say, oh well, everybody's got hard drives lying around, so we won't add it in. Well, not everyone does, so we're going to put that in the price. For the case, we've got the Fractal Design Core 1000 case. This is a micro ATX case, well, it supports micro ATX motherboards, and comes with a 120mm fan in the front. It takes up to two 5¼ drive bays, two 3¼ hard drives, and it's kind of a design like the Echo 250. I'm not sure who stole what from who, but they both have the same kind of hard drive mounting mechanism, except the Echo case has like two of them, so you can fit twice the hard drives in. I was actually going to buy a really cheap case, like a £10 case, but I decided to, you know, just spend a little bit more on something that was a bit more quality to it, and something that has a lot of options. On this case, you can fit up to 3,000 in it, so if you ever want to upgrade, you can easily throw a graphics card in there without the whole system overheating, as long as you put a few more fans in there. Same thing with the power supply. The power supply I've got, it has a 6+2 pin graphics card power connector. So if you want to crossfire this with a graphics card, no idea why you'd want to do that, but if you did want to in the future, you could throw a graphics card in there. Or if you upgrade the system completely, you can still put a graphics in there and use the power supply for your future system. So if you were using a cheap power supply like the one I just showed you, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would have no graphics card power connectors. And you could use a Molex to 6-pin adapter, but it would probably blow up because they're not really capable. They don't have enough amps on the 12-volt rail to power any substantial graphics cards. So now let's look at the cost of this machine. This is the cost for all of the parts new listed, which adds up to around £224. I also added a 92mm fan to the rear of the case. I had one lying around, but it would cost around £3 new. I also needed a fan splitter to be able to power the fan, as the motherboard only has one case fan header. This costs 99p. Add shipping and the total of this build comes to £223.46p. When assembling this machine, a few downsides of the case became apparent. There is only space for a 92mm rear fan, and there are no cable mounting options, meaning you have to stuff all of these superfluous cables into the 5¼ drive bays, but the front panel cables will still hang loose. Also, the backplate included with the motherboard is silver instead of black, making it stand out on this case. The SATA cables included with this motherboard are blue, which is very odd, so I opened up my SATA cable box and got a black cable. Not that anyone is ever going to look inside the case. The next thing that struck me was the included AMD stock cooler. It's virtually identical to the stock cooler that came with my AMD Sempron almost a decade ago. I really wish they had included the AMD stock cooler with the heat pipes that they include with the FX 8350 processors. If you compare this to the included stock cooler, you'll see that the base of the heatsink is not actually large enough to make full contact with the CPU. This is quite disappointing, as it means you'll need to purchase an aftermarket cooler just to get within acceptable noise and cooling levels. So now that the build's finished, it's time to turn it on. When I got into the BIOS menu, something became painfully obvious. The CPU temperature showed over 65 degrees Celsius, and it kept rising to over 75 before I shut the machine off. I thought the cooler may not have been seated properly, so I removed it and applied new thermal paste. This had absolutely no effect on the temperatures. When running a stress test in Windows, the CPU temperature reached over 110 degrees. To try and resolve this, I installed an Arctic Freezer 13 cooler. This had absolutely no effect on the temperatures. It turns out this is in fact a common issue with these processors, and the temperature sensors are just crap. The correct CPU temperature reading was actually the TM pin 3 readout, not the CPU temperature readout. This means that automatic fan control through the BIOS will not work properly. You need to set this manually with temperature estimates. So let's look at the benchmarks. The boot time into Windows 8 was 22 seconds, and considering that's on a mechanical hard drive, it's a very respectable time. Now, let's look at the gaming benchmarks. Batman Arkham Origins, lowest settings, 1080p, average is 22 frames per second. At 720p, 24 frames per second. At 640 by 480, 29 frames per second. So, completely unplayable. Now, Unreal Tournament 3, lowest settings. At 1080p, 49 FPS. At 720p, 83 FPS. So, that's kind of playable at 720p. Battlefield 3, multiplayer. Now, at 1080p, is averaged 23 FPS. So completely unplayable. At 720p, 39 FPS, which is still unplayable, because when you're playing it would drop down to below 10 FPS whenever you went in smoke or an explosion. 640 by 480, 84 FPS. So you can play Battlefield 3 at 640 by 480, but you can't see anything, so there's not much point. Skyrim, lowest settings at 1080p, 29 FPS, 720p, 41 FPS average. And again, this is not really playable as it's not constant 40 FPS. It drops down below 20 during smoke and fire. Crysis 2 minimum settings, 1080p, 12 FPS, 720p, 31 FPS. At 800 by 480, 59 FPS. So if you wanted to play it at that resolution and you put it full screen, it'll look worse than Duke Nukem 3D. And in windowed mode you won't be able to see it, so there isn't much point to it. So let's look at some less demanding games. How about Team Fortress 2? Lowest settings, multiplayer, at 1080p, 41 FPS average. At 720p, 49 FPS. And again, if that was constant, it would be playable. But it's not. It drops below 30 with smoke and explosions, so it's not really playable. Killing Floor, lowest settings, 1080p, 60 FPS, which is kind of playable, but it drops down to below 40. So, how about, I'll say, Minecraft. Minecraft, 71 FPS, maximum settings. So it plays Minecraft quite well, but so does a Raspberry Pi. In fact, there wasn't a single new game with even the slightest demanding graphics that was playable at 1080p. It even struggled to play old games like Quake 4 at high settings. And according to benchmarks, the gain you'll see from using 1600 MHz RAM is 5 FPS at most. And using 2400 MHz RAM over 1333, 15 FPS increase. But the price gain just makes it defeat the purpose of having a APU for gaming, for budget gaming. Now, I also tried using a 1600 MHz RAM module, overclocked to 1866. Using a single 8GB stick, the frame rates are almost cut in half. Presumably this is due to the RAM being in single channel mode, so you're better off using two 1333 modules than a single 1866 module, just for the performance gain of using dual channel mode. So let's have a look at the realities of a build like this. Number one, it's extremely loud and extremely difficult to configure the fan profiles to get it quiet without overheating, just due to the fact that the temperature sensors don't work properly. Here's what the machine sounds like at idle. And here's what it sounds like under load. Number two, it can't play new demanding games. You may be able to get away with older games, and games that are extremely undemanding, but according to Passmark, an NVIDIA 8800 GT will outperform the graphics processor on this APU. Number three, while it's good for multimedia, such as 1080p playback, so is the Intel GMA 3000, from which you can build a lower cost system that'll perform the same with multimedia. Number four, Crossfire is a waste of time. If you were to crossfire a graphics card with the integrated GPU, it would cost you the same amount as the APU itself to buy, and even though you have twice the power, you'll still have two crap graphics cards, and you won't be able to fully utilize the power of the second graphics card. you're better off getting a decent graphics card right from the start. Next time I will be doing a legitimate budget gaming build, whilst making it as cheap as possible, but using parts that are actually suited to playing games. So be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see that video.